Thank you for joining us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and our topic today is racism. Here with us to explore at least some aspects of it, we won't expect him to do the whole racism issue today, is Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad. He's director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture here in New York, and also the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. And thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Carol, for having me.
All right, so you've written about race, you've written about criminality. We have so much going on in the United States today, in Black America and America as a whole. I want to start, though, by asking you to place yourself in this Black America, in this America. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Your influences?
Sure. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the early 70s, came of age, as I like to say, in Reagan's America. I was a child of the post-civil rights era, someone whose parents were both college educated and both committed to my educational success, and really placed with me the responsibility of looking forward and not looking backwards. And that had both the possibilities of success and also some perils.
Well, the looking backwards would have included quite a memorable family dynasty. Your great-grandfather was Elijah Muhammad, who founded the Nation of Islam, mentored Malcolm X. It's now run by Louis Farrakhan, but you're not a part of the nation. When was the separation point for you?
Sure. So I was born just a couple of years before my great-grandfather died. And his death, as everyone knows, created tremendous uncertainty about the future of the nation. My great-uncle, Warith Deen Muhammad, Imam Muhammad, separated from the nation and established essentially a Sunni American Muslim movement in this country. My family, my father, my aunts and uncles, and even grandparents eventually moved in that direction as well. So the nation proper is not very well represented among my larger family in that sense because of the separation that occurred between my great-grandfather's passing and my own. I happen to be a child of divorced parents, and my mother never converted, and so having grown up mostly with my mom, I also was not immediately connected to what was going on in the nation as well.
Right. Well, I was surprised to learn that your dad was a Pulitzer Prize winning, still is, winning photojournalist who was with the New York Times, for a very, very long time.
Yes.
And you were asking if we knew each other, and I said, I'm sure we ran into each other on the streets covering stories, and he did a lot of really, really important work in Africa as well.
Yeah, I'm very proud of my father, and he's had an amazing career, recently retired, but continues to do work. He's helping Brian Stevenson out in Montgomery, Alabama with his project on memorializing lynching victims across the country.
Wow, that's wonderful. And Ozier, we should say.
Oh, that's right, Ozier Muhammad.
Give him his credit,
yes.
Because now the current work that he's doing is so important as
Absolutely.
well. I want to ask you about your hometown, Chicago.
Sure.
If ever, a city deserved multiple shows of its own, it's Chicago and what's going on there now. When you see the tremendous crime and the tremendous upsetting incidents, what's your reaction to all of that?
Well, my reaction is that Chicago, like Detroit, are places that are bellwethers of the kinds of policies and practices that we've institutionalized in this country. It's not an accident that Dr. King in 1966 set his sights on Chicago and came to the quick conclusion that it was more segregated, more problematic, and indeed its racism was more entrenched than it had been in Birmingham and other places. That legacy is still with us, and unfortunately the arc of our belief in inevitable progress because of the Civil Rights Acts doesn't reflect the fact that in Chicago Black people could vote in the early 20th century. That Black people could put a congressman in Washington in 1928, long before we got to the 1965 Voting Rights Acts. So Chicago, like Detroit and other places, reflect the institutional and structural barriers to equality in this country that have never truly gotten their fair due.
Well, and certainly the instance of Laquan McDonald, a young 17-year-old gunned down. The video of his murder, shall we say, held for 400 days before it was released. And when you see the video, and we're going to show this as we talk, and we'll give you a cautionary note that it is very, very disturbing. So children should not be seeing this, and if you want to turn away. But this is what ultimately was released. When you see it, it is so... it's not ambiguous at all of what's happening. Here's a 17-year-old kid with his back, walking away from the police and is gunned down. Who is complicit in this? I know that there are calls for Mayor Rahm Emanuel to resign. The police chief has resigned. The police officer Van Dyke has been accused of murder. In your mind, how far does the complicity go?
Well, there are two episodes here. There's the actual shooting itself, and then there's the cover-up. Where the shooting is concerned, we have yet another example of a quick-triggered police officer who sees essentially a threat that doesn't exist. And this is a problem both in the kind of training that officers receive, the larger societal messages about public safety and threats around every corner, and particularly the way that officers have engaged black communities, black and white or Hispanic officers, for far too long. The second part of this is the response of the officers in that moment, those who were witnesses to the shooting, and every series of decisions that happened after that. All of them are complicit. Because if I run an institution as I do in the Schomburg, and one of my employees does something that dehumanizes another or breaks the law, then I'm going to hold them accountable first, both as their supervisor, but I'm also going to hold those who are witnesses to this in the workplace accountable. So we've got a culture of silence. We've long talked about it, but we don't have a culture of accountability. And so those officers are on the hook for that accountability. And of course, it goes without saying that everyone from the state's attorney to the mayor of the city, to any number of city council members who were party to this instance,
who saw the video,
and the settlement and the cover-up are all complicit.
Right, because the settlement with the family came very quickly.
That's right.
And the demand for the video came 400 days later. Do you think Rahm Emanuel should resign from his position as mayor of Chicago?
I think it'd be the right thing to do, given his failure of leadership on some key issues, from public education to public safety. But that's his decision. There's no legal structure to allow for it. And ultimately, politicians don't necessarily throw themselves on the sacrificial sword for the benefit of the places that they govern. They're politicians in part because they see themselves as natural-born leaders who are capable of being good stewards of the public trust. So as much as I would love to see Rahm Emanuel step down and to say, I failed this city and I'm going to help to support a transformation of the city as someone who can give advice to the next leader because of the mistakes that I made, he's going to stick around to finish out his term.
So the Chicago Tribune has been running an update on the shootings in Chicago, and they are up dramatically in this year. In January, almost 300 shootings. Sure. Not fatalities, but shootings. And what it goes to is this, the placing of blame for violence. And this is a lot of gang-related shootings. Now, as I understand it, fueled by social media, where they're taunting each other and threatening each other online, sure. And then they take to the streets to defend their honor or seek revenge. You've written about this, the whole what you call the violence card, as opposed to the race card that's played so often. Talk with us about that.
Well, partly we have a cynical political culture that reads premature death, Black death, or violence among African Americans within their own communities as evidence of the pathology and a dysfunction that exists within that community, as if that is not symptomatic of larger structural forces that reproduce inequality or send signals that these communities don't really matter. That's a false trade. Ultimately, as Dr. King argued, as I argue in my own work, our structures matter to what people believe about the social contract and their pathways for mobility, their belief in something bigger than themselves. And it turns out that just about 100 years ago, Chicago's streets ran with blood of white ethnics, of European immigrants, of the Irish, of the Polish, of Jews even. And the response was not to say that these people are their own worst enemies or that this is a crisis of white-on-white violence. The response was to say, what can we do to build pro-social communities where people believe in not only themselves, but the people and the stewards of the state, the police, the politicians, the job structures, the manufacturing base. All of that was the attention of people like Jane Addams and so many others that helped to quell violence in those communities because the young people had something to believe in.
Right. Well, and they described what was going on as grisly murders every single morning.
Absolutely.
It was horrific.
The scale and scope, little different than what we have today.
And yet the response was, I love the word of compassionate. We must find a compassionate way of dealing.
That's right.
With, I mean, what were criminals as well, as well, but
they actually use the term, call them an army of unfortunates.
Right, precisely.
So the notion that you could take young people who were both victims and perpetrators and blur that distinction to say that these are people who need our help, that they can end up on either side of a violent transaction, but ultimately we are responsible for helping them and the communities that they live in.
But that seems to be lacking. I know that there are missions to do something similar on some scale, but who should be ultimately responsible for that? Is that, a federal government issue? I don't want to say program because that falls into, bad territory.
Yes.
But who should be doing something?
Well, the state is ultimately on the hook for safety. I mean, the Republicans will tell you this. I mean, they certainly pride themselves on reminding us of the limits of the constitutional authority of the federal government. But the first responsibility of the state is safety. Safety from external threats and safety from internal threats. So the quality of life, literally life and death, matters to our governments. That's what they are instituted for. So in the case of Laquan McDonald, when we see that our state is as likely to commit acts of illegal violence against its own citizens, and then the state participates in an active cover-up, we are way at the wrong end of the level, the curve of responsibility in terms of what the state should do. But philanthropy is also on the hook, and I'll give you an example. There are organizations like Cure Violence, which take an epidemiological approach to violence in the community. These are the credible messengers featured in a documentary called The Interrupters. These are people within the community who have understood violence, have lived with it, and then go out and mentor young people, talk to them about conflict resolution. And these organizations like Cure Violence, they're in many cities in this country, can't get enough funding to do their work. They show dramatic reductions in actual violence in the communities where they are doing work. And when they want to replicate that work elsewhere, people throw their hands up and say, oh, we don't have money for that. So that is a political crisis in search of will and courage amongst the gatekeepers of our tax dollars and the decisions we make about where we put resources.
Well, and you write a lot about police, and that one of your next books will be about that. The policing issue that's been with us all of this time, from the 1890s to, 2016.
Absolutely.
Still that, caustic, often troubling relationship. But I was just looking at some of the stories about Flint, Michigan, and the poisoning of so many black children, especially, hundreds, if not more than that, and that structural racism. Talk a little bit about that. In a recent article, there were, a writer who talked about that there was Flint, there was Ferguson, there was Katrina. These are all part of the endurance of structural racism.
Well, what we see is that our financial decisions have tremendous social impacts. So when we govern our cities, when we make policy decisions about what we can afford, whether it is our bridges or our tunnels or our water supplies, we are ultimately making calculated risks about the quality of life of those who will be affected by those decisions. And so ultimately, Katrina, what we initially described as a great natural disaster, turned out to be a man-made disaster.
Precisely.
Because we made decisions about the quality of the levee system in the poorest communities where people were, by definition, vulnerable because those communities counted less than others. The financial decision to shift the water supply from Detroit to Flint was calculated based on the political power of the people in that community. Those people didn't have much because the governor, through his emergency manager, had decided that the local people were not going to govern themselves. And when those complaints started to roll in, the governor and the emergency manager and the staff in between decided that they were just engaging in political theater. So this culture of financial decision-making, of efficiency, of strategic plans, and a kind of technocratic approach to governing ourselves where we're constantly weighing costs and benefits will constantly reproduce inequality and violence to communities, particularly those who have the least political currency. And in that case, we're talking about Black and brown America.
Now, and one of the upshots of Ferguson, one of the things that we learned was that the police or the city government was ticketing the Black community to the point of, I mean, it was floating the whole city. And now that they are not doing that anymore, they're facing bankruptcy.
Right.
You know.
Well, the other side of that kind of exploitation that we saw, of the violence, is the exploitation. So on one hand, you get a kind of malign neglect, and on the other hand, you get a kind of rapacious exploitation in the case of revenue ticketing and policing practices.
And what's your cure for all of this? Being a student of it, writing books about it, where do we go?
Well, we need to stop kidding ourselves about how great we are as a nation across the board. I mean, we are very good at sound bites about America's exceptionalism, about being the world's beacon of democracy. And much of the ideals that gave birth to this nation are truly exceptional. And much of the capacity of this nation to get it right at moments of tremendous crisis is also true. But what isn't true is that we get it right all the time. And what is also true is that we seem to be in a moment where we keep reproducing leadership that is beholden to the elite. And so if that leadership is beholden to the elite because of Citizens United in terms of a political speech of corporations and wealthy donors, then we shouldn't be surprised that poor people or minorities or people who are less influential keep ending up on the short end of our social and political stick. And that's got to change. And ultimately, the power of democracy to change that is built into this system. But if we can't figure out how to change the terms of our democracy, then we're going to end up reproducing these problems. So that is the work that millennials will have to engage in. That is the work of the 2016 presidential election. And maybe it won't get fixed this time, but that is where the fight is.
Well, I hear a lot of mostly young people that I talk to who have opted out of the political system. They don't see the solution there. And obviously during this whole time, the Black Lives Matter movement, the streets have worked much better. I shouldn't laugh, but the streets have worked much better than the political process in bringing change about. Presidents of universities resigning.
Right.
You know,
No, I appreciate you saying that because I want to backtrack a little on that political statement, because cultural change is the predicate of political change, meaning that what those young people are doing is they're helping to expand the cultural dimensions of the debate. They're helping us to rethink what are our fundamental values, because if our values are askew or they're not shared sufficiently, they don't extend to certain zip codes in our community, then of course our politics will reflect that. I'm a big fan of what Reverend Barber is doing down in North Carolina, a big fan of his approach to fusion politics, bringing together whites and blacks, Latinos and Asians around shared values of governance and the quality of life that the people of North Carolina should expect.
I want to talk a little bit about the Schomburg because we're almost at the end of our time, but 10 million items, because I think it's important to know our history.
Absolutely.
The segue here is, so that we can deal with our
We've
present.
talked a lot about history,
Exactly.
So it's always with us.
Exactly. So 10 million items related to Black America that are housed at the Schomburg. Tell us what people can find when they go there.
Sure. Well, what you can find is a place that is committed to cultural preservation and heritage, but also a place for the continuance continual learning from the past. So on one hand, we have collections ranging from Malcolm X and Maya Angelou and Lorraine Hansberry and Ralph Bunche, to a place that exhibits these collections not for the purposes of creating distance between the past and the present, but for the purposes of closing that gap, for inviting young people into an intimate relationship with the past so that they can see in these heroes and heroines, people like Maya Angelou, for example, whose fifth grade scrapbook demonstrates that she was a kid once too, who had an assignment to make a scrapbook, and it looks no different than what my fourth grader would do at home. That intimacy with the past is the first invitation for them to become part of our civic project. Because if they don't believe that history is powerful, other people will use history against them. And that's what the Schomburg Center stands for.
And what I find, too, is that so many don't believe that their own personal lives and contributions are worthy of preserving. And that's a wonderful gift, right, that there is a place for papers to be preserved for future use.
That's right. And again, history, the metaphor that I use is if you were going into battle, you'd want to know what military approaches worked in the past. You'd want to have a blueprint. A religious metaphor, the New Testament doesn't make sense without the Old Testament. I mean, why did we need this prophet to tell us, how to live our lives differently if there hadn't been chaos and mayhem before? Well, you can't end up in 2016 with a set of limitations and a way of being in the world without understanding how the world came to be. And that's all of our responsibility. And the Schomburg Center just happens to be the single most important place for telling those stories about Black people.
Right. I love the bringing together of the archivists and the activists,
That's right.
Which is, let's put this material to use.
That's
it's
right.
not just to, your shelves aren't dusty. I used
We are
it.
not a museum.
I used it for the work in my own book, and I would get lost there. It's just such a wonderful place, just so reaffirming to be able to, to find parts of yourself and your history, at the ready and available to you. You do a lot of talks there as well.
That's right. We do a lot of talks. We have Michael Eric Dyson has come recently to talk about his biography of President Obama. We recently had L.A. Reid, the music producer, to talk about a memoir. We have a brand new center dedicated to transatlantic slavery called the Lapidus Center. And the Lapidus Center is a place not only for the exploration through and a magnificent collection of 18th and early 19th century publications about the abolition of slave trade, but also as a place for ongoing engagement. We had recently a teacher's workshop during Professional Development Day here in New York City, where teachers came to learn how to teach slavery in their classrooms. How can we live in a country where slavery ultimately was the greatest economic engine for the wealth of this nation, and we don't teach it to our own students? It is both a story of economic progress and of racial trauma. But in those two stories, we keep seeing America go down this path. And the only way to disrupt that path is that we teach it to our students so that they learn from it and create different values and different institutions for the future.
And we've had the recent incidents of schools teaching or using books that portray slavery, for instance, as a happy condition.
As happy slavery.
Right. I mean, which is...
We got to do better. We have to do so much better. I mean, Walter Dean Myers wrote that only about 3% of children's books a couple of years ago published annually featured Black protagonists. How can we be headed to an inexorable Black future, Black and brown future in America, if we can't stop finally and acknowledge, as Dr. King often did, that we've been ignoring and erasing the contributions of Black people to American society? It's got to stop.
And you're working on two books now.
Yes.
Talk to us about, one is policing and the other is
the other one
vanishing.
Yes. The other one is a history of how we went from a world where there clearly was something known as white criminality, there were dead bodies piling up on streets, to a world today where we only really think about white criminality in Hollywood depictions of it, or HBO series, that we don't actually use the signifier whiteness and criminality together. And yet we have epic episodes of heroin and methamphetamine addiction ravaging rural America. So I want to fill in the gap in our understanding of what happened to white people in criminality, because as many people have pointed out, most white people commit violent acts against other white people. But it seems almost like a thought experiment when you say this in public debate, because everybody knows what black people do to each other, but most of us think, white people don't do bad things to each other, but of course they do. So this is a history to unpack how we got to that silence.
Right. In the recent political debates and progress, this increased the amount of drug abuse in a state like New Hampshire,
Sure.
which is what I think the largest in the country or the worst in the country, and yet one would never think that. New Hampshire.
Well, first of all, it's not about what white people are doing to each other. And in the case of, and it bears stating, the governor of Maine blaming their crisis of drug addiction amongst an overwhelmingly white population on black drug dealers coming up from New York and Connecticut, which again is another form of scapegoating of blackness to wash away or whitewash what's happening in white America. My point is not to apportion blame here and in every direction. My point is to help us understand that the problems that impact communities, whether they are black, white, or brown, are generally universal problems. And we have to get away from racializing those problems, because that's a convenient way of saying that we are not on the hook as a society, or our state actors are not on the hook for saving certain communities because of what they do to each other.
Exactly. Now, as we close, we ask our guests to finish the sentence.
Sure.
The strength, the power of Black America lies in. What is that for you?
In its capacity to speak universal truth to power. We often think of black people speaking for black people, but black people have in this country often spoken truly for the significance and meaning of democracy, because they felt the absence of it more than any other population. And that historical tradition remains with us and will carry us forward to the future.
Well, I thank you so much for being with us today. Fascinating. I'm looking forward to your next two books. There's an academic for you, a historian. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you,
Mahmoud.
Carol, for having me.
And thank you so much, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, for being our guest today. And thank you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins, and we'll see you the next time on Black America.